Good evening, my dear two-legged friends. My name is Khenti, which means crocodile in ancient Egyptian, quite ironic for a cat. I know, but the priests had a sense of humor about these things. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable beds, with your soft pillows and clean sheets, I want to tell you something that no history book has ever mentioned, no archaeologist has ever discovered, and no scholar has ever imagined. I want to tell you what it was really like to live with Ra, the sun god himself. Now, before you dismiss this as just another bedtime story, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy what I do here. Subscribe only if you genuinely find these tales soothing. I'm a cat, after all, and we appreciate authenticity. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Are you watching the sunrise I once knew so intimately, or perhaps settling into the darkness that I learned to navigate by divine light? Dim your lights now, if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, rhythmic hum that reminds me of temple wines. Close your eyes and let's journey together to a time when gods walked among mortals, when the Nile ran cleaner than your modern rivers, and when a small temple cat named Khenti became confidant to the most powerful deity in the ancient world. It was the year 1323 BCE, during the reign of that boy pharaoh you humans remember as Tutankhamun. The great heresy of Akhenaten had ended, the old gods had been restored to their rightful places, and Egypt was golden under the endless summer sun. I lived in the temple of Ra at Heliopolis, the city of the sun where massive obelisks pierced the sky like stone prayers, and the scent of frankincense mixed with the warm smell of baking bread from the priest's quarters. The temple complex was vast, my friends. Imagine corridors of honey-colored sandstone stretching longer than your city blocks, their walls covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to dance in the flickering light of oil lamps. The floors were smooth, limestone, worn glass-like by thousands of sandaled feet and bare soles of pilgrims who had traveled the length of the Nile to glimpse divine glory. In the morning, the air would fill with the deep voices of priests singing the dawn hymns, their bronze sistrum rattles creating a rhythm that made my whiskers tingle. The sound would bounce off the stone walls and rise toward painted ceilings where golden stars mapped out celestial journeys I would come to know intimately. Frankincense and myrrh burned constantly in braziers throughout the complex, creating clouds of sacred smoke that drifted lazily toward small windows cut high in the walls. The smoke carried prayers upward, also the priests believed. Little did they know that their God was much closer than they imagined, and that he was desperately lonely despite all their devoted attention. But while humans see grand monuments and divine glory, we cats noticed different things. I noticed the fat temple mice that had grown lazy from easy living among grain stores. I noticed the cool spots where limestone blocks had been perfectly fitted, creating delicious patches of shade during the scorching afternoon hours. I noticed how the high priest Amenhotep's hands shook slightly during morning rituals, and how his assistant priest Kamwaset always stood a little too close to the treasury chambers. Most importantly, I noticed the strange warmth that had nothing to do with the Egyptian sun. It was a presence that made my fur stand on end in the most pleasant way, a sensation like being stroked by invisible hands that knew exactly where cats most loved to be touched. Other animals felt it too. The sacred ibises would go silent when it passed, and even the temple monkeys would stop their chattering and thievery. At first, I thought it was simply the magic that all sacred places possess. Every temple has its own energy, its own personality. Some feel stern and judgmental, others warm and welcoming. The temple of Ra felt expectant, as if it were waiting for something or someone. I remember the exact moment I realized I was not alone in my observations. It was during the third hour after sunrise, when the priests had finished their dawn ceremonies and were breaking their fast in the side chambers. I was sunning myself on a limestone block that had been warmed by the first rays of morning light, enjoying that perfect cat moment when the warmth soaks through your fur and into your bones. That's when I heard it, not with my ears, but somehow deeper, in the place where purrs begin. A voice like distant thunder, gentle as summer rain on the Nile, ancient as the stones beneath my paws. "Little hunter," it said, "you see what others cannot." I should have been frightened. Any sensible cat would have arched their back and fled. But instead, I found myself purring louder, as if responding to a call I had been waiting my entire life to hear. "You're him," I thought back, somehow, knowing that my thoughts could be heard. "You're our I am," came the reply, warm with something that might have been amusement. "And you, little crocodile named Cat, are exactly what I have been hoping to find." And that, my dear listeners, was how a temple cat in ancient Egypt became the closest friend and confidant of the sun god himself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the very beginning, when I was nothing more than a starving kitten in the streets of Memphis, with no idea that my destiny lay in the golden halls of divinity. Before I became companion to a god, I was nothing more than another street kitten fighting for survival in the narrow alleys of Memphis. The memories of those early weeks still make my whiskers twitch with phantom hunger. Picture, if you will, a small orange and white kitten, all ribs and oversized ears, darting between the wheels of ox-drawn carts and dodging the casual kicks of merchants who saw stray animals as nothing more than nuisances. The streets of Memphis were not kind to small creatures. The smell of rotting fish from the market stalls, mixed with human waste and the acrid smoke from pottery kilns, creating an atmosphere that burned the nose and throat. During the day, the limestone-paved streets became so hot they could burn the pads of tiny paws, forcing me to seek shade in whatever narrow spaces I could find between mud brick buildings. Food was a constant obsession. I learned to time the emptying of household scraps, to recognize which vendors might drop a morsel of bread or dried fish, and to avoid the territorial older cats who ruled the choicest hunting grounds. Water was even more precious than food. The Nile was too far from the market district, and the cisterns were jealously guarded by humans who had little patience for thirsty animals. Sleep came in fragments, always alert for the danger that prowled. Both day and night, feral dogs hunted in packs after dark, and even in daylight there were hazards everywhere. Chariot wheels could crush a small body in an instant, and some humans found sport in throwing stones at cats they believed brought bad luck. It was during one of those desperately hungry dawn expeditions that fate intervened. I had caught the scent of fresh bread from the direction of the great temple complex on the city's outskirts. Following my nose had always served me well, and the promise of food scraps near such a wealthy place seemed worth the dangerous journey across unfamiliar territory. The Temple of Ra at Heliopolis loomed before me like a mountain made by human hands. Massive walls of white limestone rose higher than I could crane my neck to see, and golden details caught the early morning sunlight like captured stars. The very air around the complex felt different, cleaner, warmer, charged with an energy that made my whiskers tingle with anticipation rather than fear. I had crept close to the main gates, hoping to find discarded offerings or perhaps mice attracted to the grain stores. When exhaustion finally overtook hunger, my tiny body simply gave out, and I collapsed in the shadow of a towering obelisk, too weak to continue searching for food. That's when he found me. High Priest Amenhotep was returning from his dawn prayers when he noticed a small orange bundle, barely breathing in the dust. Humans often speak of divine providence, and perhaps that's exactly what it was. Of all the priests who might have passed that spot, it was the kindest one who discovered me first. Amenhotep was a man in his middle years, with gentle hands and eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of smiling. His head was shaved clean, in the manner of all his priests, and his simple linen robes spoke of someone who valued comfort over display. Unlike many religious officials, he had not grown fat on temple offerings or harsh from wielding spiritual authority. Those gentle hands lifted me with infinite care, and I found myself cradled against warm linen that smelled of frankincense and cedar oil. For the first time in my brief life, I felt completely safe. The priest murmured soft words in the formal temple dialect as he carried me through gates that were larger than most houses, past walls covered in colorful paintings of gods and pharaohs, into a world that seemed touched by magic. My first impression of life inside the temple complex was overwhelming abundance. Where the streets had been hot, dirty, and dangerous, the temple courtyards were cool, clean, and welcoming. Fountains bubbled with fresh water brought from the purest stretches of the Nile. Garden areas provided shade, and the soft rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. The very stones seemed to radiate a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the sun overhead, but most importantly, from a kitten's perspective, the temple was alive with prey. Fat mice scurried between grain storage jars, clearly having lived easy lives without serious predation. Temple monkeys chattered in the date palms, occasionally dropping fruits that attracted beetles and small lizards. Even the sacred ibises, with their dignified bearing and protected status, could not prevent smaller birds from nesting in the cornices and leaving scattered seeds for opportunistic hunters. The priest quarters, where Amenhotep took me, were modest but comfortable. Reed mats covered stone floors, keeping them warm underfoot. Oil lamps provided steady light even after sunset, banishing the fearful darkness that had plagued my street existence. Most wonderfully, there were regular meals, not scraps fought over with other desperate animals, but actual bowls of milk, portions of fresh fish, and even occasional treats of honey-sweetened bread. For a kitten who had known only hunger and fear, this was paradise beyond imagination. The mice here were so well fed and complacent that catching them required no real skill. Water was always available in decorated pottery bowls. Soft sleeping spots abounded, from woven baskets to sun-warmed windowsills to the luxurious comfort of reed mats that priests used for meditation. But gradually, as my belly filled and my strength returned, I began to notice that this place was different in ways that went beyond material comfort. There was an awareness here, a presence that watched and waited. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. Other times I would feel eyes upon me, gentle but ancient, beyond measure. The sensation was strongest during the daily rituals, when priests gathered to sing the dawn and sunset hymns, as their voices rose in harmony, offering praise to Ra for his daily journey across the sky. The very air would shimmer with something that made my fur stand on end in the most pleasant way possible. I was no longer just a rescued kitten. I was, though I didn't yet understand it, being prepared for a purpose I could never have imagined. In those first weeks of temple life, I developed what you might call a routine. Dawn brought the priests' morning hymns, their voices echoing through stone corridors as they welcomed Ri's daily rebirth in the eastern sky. I would position myself on the highest accessible rooftop, watching the sun emerge from the darkness with the focused attention that only cats can maintain 4 hours at a time. The priests below performed their rituals with clockwork precision, lighting braziers, arranging offerings of bread and beer, chanting prayers in the ancient formal language that predated even the pharaohs. They moved like dancers who had rehearsed the same performance for decades, every gesture deliberate, every word pronounced with reverent care. Yet something puzzled me about these ceremonies. The priest spoke to Ra as if he were listening from an infinite distance, their voices raised toward the sky, their arms stretched upward in supplication. They acted as if their God was somewhere far above the clouds, reachable only through elaborate ritual and perfect pronunciation of sacred words. But my whiskers told a different story. That peculiar tingling sensation I'd noticed upon arriving at the temple grew stronger during these ceremonies, not weaker. Whatever divine presence inhabited this place felt close, immediate, almost lonely. While the priests projected their prayers skyward, I sensed something much nearer, watching from the shadows between the columns, listening to every word with an attention that bordered on desperation. The realization struck me gradually, the way dawn creeps across the Nile Valley. Ra wasn't distant, he was here, present in his own temple, closer than the priests imagined. And he was paying attention to everything, including one small orange, cat who seemed to be the only creature aware of his proximity. The first direct contact came during what should have been a routine morning ceremony. High Priest Amenhotep was performing the daily renewal ritual, lighting the sacred flame that represented his rebirth, when something went wrong. His hands, usually so steady and sure, began to tremble violently. The ceremonial torch slipped from his fingers, clattering across the stone floor as he collapsed to his knees. The other priests rushed to his aid, but their movements seemed sluggish, as if they were moving through thick honey. Panic rippled through the chamber as the sacred flame guttered and died, leaving the sanctuary in unnatural darkness despite the bright morning sun streaming through the windows. That's when I heard the voice for the first time, not a sound, but as something that resonated in the space between my thoughts and dreams. "Little hunter." The words carried no threat, only a profound weariness mixed with something that might have been hope. I felt my attention drawn upward, though I saw nothing there except the painted ceiling with its golden stars and flying scarab beetles. "Help me understand these creatures." The request was so unexpected, so unlike what any human would expect from a god, that I almost thought I had imagined it. Gods, according to the priests, were omniscient beings who understood everything about mortal existence. They didn't ask for help from temple cats, but the voice continued, growing stronger and more defined, as if my acknowledgement had given it substance. "They worship what they cannot see, yet I am here among them every day. They sing of my glory while I watch from arm's length, and still they do not know me. Their prayers reach my ears, but their hearts remain close to my presence." As the god spoke, Amenhotep slowly regained his composure, rising to his feet with the help of his assistant priests. The sacred flame rekindled itself without any human intervention, burning with unusual brightness as if fed by invisible hands. The ceremony resumed, but I could feel his attention had shifted entirely to our conversation. "You sense me when they cannot. You see what they miss. Tell me, small hunter, why do mortals make their gods so distant when they crave closeness above all else?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke, complex and layered with meanings I was only beginning to understand. Here was Ra, supposedly the most powerful deity in the Egyptian pantheon, admitting to loneliness and confusion about the very mortals who devoted their lives to serving him. Over the following days, these conversations became more frequent and more revealing. Ra would speak to me during the quiet hours between ceremonies, when the priests were busy with administrative duties or personal study. His voice grew more familiar, less like distant thunder and more like wind through papyrus reeds, ancient but gentle, powerful but somehow vulnerable. He told me of the weight of being responsible for life itself, of carrying the sun across the sky each day, knowing that every living thing depended on his successful completion of that journey. He spoke of the loneliness of immortality, of watching civilizations rise and fall, while he remained unchanging, untouchable, worshipped, but never truly known. "They see me as perfection," he confided during one sunset conversation. "But perfection cannot learn, cannot grow, cannot be surprised by friendship or delighted by simple pleasures. They have made me into something so far above them that I can no longer reach down to touch their daily lives." I began to understand that Ri's request for help was genuine. He needed someone who could bridge the gap between divine and mortal perspectives, someone who understood both the complexity of divine responsibility and the simple truths of mortal existence. As a cat, I was perfectly positioned for this role. We understand humans better than they understand themselves, yet we remain independent enough to see their behavior with objective clarity. "Teach me about them," Ra asked. "Help me understand why they fear what they worship, why they complicate what should be simple, why they seek in elaborate ritual what they could find in a moment of genuine connection." And so began the strangest friendship in the history of both gods and cats. I became Ri's cultural interpreter, his guide to understanding the mortals who served him with such devotion yet knew him so little. In return, he offered me something No cat had ever experienced the perspective of divinity itself, the chance to see the world through eyes that had witnessed the birth of stars and the first stirring of life in the Nile's ancient waters. It was an arrangement that would change both of us in ways neither could have anticipated. Living with a god, I quickly discovered, was nothing like the stories priests told or the images painted on temple walls. Ra didn't spend his days sitting majestically on a golden throne surrounded by lesser deities offering tribute. Instead, he was remarkably domestic. Well, as domestic an immortal being responsible for maintaining cosmic order could be. Our mornings began before dawn. In those quiet moments when the world balanced between night and day, I would wait to find the air around me warming with a gentle heat that had nothing to do with braziers or oil lamps. Ra's presence felt like lying in a patch of perfect sunlight, the kind that makes cats purr involuntarily and stretch their paws. In pure contentment, "Good morning, little hunter." His voice would murmur through my consciousness, carrying the warmth of affection that had grown between us. Are you ready to watch the birth of another day? These pre-dawn conversations became my favorite part of each day. While the priests below still slept, Ra would share his preparations for the daily journey across the sky. He spoke of checking the cosmic mechanisms that kept the sun on its proper course, of reinforcing the barriers that held back the chaos serpent Apophis, of gathering the energy needed to sustain all life on Earth for another day. Mortals think it happens automatically, he told me one morning, amusement coloring his mental voice. They see the sun rise and assume it's as inevitable as the Nile flowing north. They don't realize that each dawn requires conscious effort, that every sunrise is a small victory against the forces that would plunge the world into eternal darkness. I found these glimpses into divine responsibility fascinating. Ra carried burdens that would crush mortal minds, yet he spoke of them with the matter-of-fact tone that priests used when discussing temple maintenance schedules. The casual enormity of his daily tasks was both humbling and oddly comforting. Breakfast was where his attempts to understand mortal experience became most apparent. Gods, it turned out, didn't technically need to eat. They sustained themselves on worship, on the energy of prayer and sacrifice, on the very act of being acknowledged and revered. But Ra had become curious about the physical pleasures that seemed to bring mortals such satisfaction. "Show me how you eat," he would request, and I would demonstrate the fine art of consuming fresh fish or milk-soaked bread. Ra would observe, with the intense concentration of a scholar studying hieroglyphs, trying to understand how the simple act of chewing and swallowing could bring such obvious contentment. "The taste exists only for moments," he mused, "yet you anticipate it, savor it, remember it. Mortals create meaning from experiences that last mere heartbeats." How remarkable. His attempts to share meals were touching in their awkwardness. Being incorporeal, Ra couldn't exactly join me for breakfast, but he could experience taste through our mental connection. I would eat slowly, savoring each bite not just for my own pleasure, but to give him the full sensation. Fresh fish caught from the temple's sacred pool, warm milk from the temple goats, honey-sweetened bread from the priest's ovens. Each flavor was a small revelation to a being who had never experienced physical sensation. I understand now why mortals become so attached to routine, Ra observed after I had finished a particularly delicious meal of grilled perch. These small pleasures create structure, anticipation, moments of pure satisfaction that make the passage of time meaningful. Our conversations during these shared meals revealed the profound loneliness that had plagued Ra for millennia. He told me of watching human civilizations develop from nomadic tribes to complex societies, always from a distance, always worshipped, but never truly companioned. "They fear to know me as I truly am," he confided. "They prefer their imagined version, the stern, perfect, unchanging deity who never doubts, never struggles, never feels lonely in the vast emptiness between stars. If they knew I sometimes question whether the sun should rise tomorrow, whether this endless cycle serves any purpose beyond mere habit. they would lose their faith entirely. I spent considerable time trying to explain to Ra why mortals seemed to prefer distant gods. From my observation of temple life, humans appeared to need their deities to be more perfect than themselves, to embody ideals they could strive toward without ever expecting to achieve. A god who admitted uncertainty would undermine their need for cosmic stability, but perfection is static, Ra protested. It cannot grow, cannot learn, cannot be surprised by unexpected friendship or delighted by simple discoveries. How can they worship something so lifeless? His questions revealed the central paradox of divinity, the very qualities that made Ra worthy of worship: his power, his immortality. His cosmic responsibilities also isolated him from the mortal experience he found increasingly fascinating. Through our friendship, he was discovering the value of limitations, the beauty of finite experiences, the meaning that mortality gave to every moment. Managing his emotional responses became an unexpected part of my daily routine. Gods, I learned, felt everything more intensely than mortals. When priests disappointed him with sloppy rituals or selfish behavior, his frustration could manifest as unseasonably hot weather that wilted crops for miles around. When particularly moving prayers reached him, his joy might cause flowers to bloom out of season throughout the temple gardens. "You're like a giant, powerful child," I told him one afternoon after his delight at a priest's heartfelt prayer had caused all the fountain water to briefly turn the color of liquid gold. "You need to learn emotional regulation before you accidentally cook someone with your enthusiasm." Ra found this comparison both insulting and hilarious. Millennia of existence, responsibility for all life on Earth, and I'm compared to a teething infant by a cat who weighs less than a temple offering bowl. But he took the advice seriously, practicing what he called divine restraint. He learned to channel intense emotions into controlled manifestations, small warming breezes instead of heat waves, gentle rain instead of floods, the soft glow of sunset colors instead of blazing auroras that would terrify the population. These lessons in emotional control strengthened our bond. Ra valued my perspective precisely because I wasn't awed by his divinity. I treated him as I would any friend who happened to be going through a difficult period, offering practical advice mixed with genuine affection. In return, he shared with me the wonders of cosmic perspective, the beauty of viewing existence from the scale of eternities rather than moments. Living with Ra taught me that even gods needed friendship, guidance, and occasionally someone to tell them when they were being unreasonable. It was a responsibility I took seriously, though I never lost sight of the profound honor of being trusted by a being who could reshape reality with a thought. Living in a temple, I quickly learned, was like living in the center of a very complicated web of human ambition, divine expectation, and religious politics. While Ra struggled to understand basic mortal emotions, the priests who served him daily were engaged in elaborate power struggles that would have impressed even the most scheming courtiers in Pharaoh's palace. The hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. At the top sat High Priest Amenhotep, the kind man who had rescued me from the temple gates. Below him ranged various levels of priests, from senior clergy who had spent decades mastering the sacred texts to young acolytes who swept floors and tended the eternal flames. Each level jealously guarded its privileges, while desperately scheming to advance to the next. What fascinated me most was how little any of them understood the God they claimed to serve. They had created an elaborate theology around Ra's supposed desires and requirements, most of which bore no resemblance to the lonely, curious being I knew personally. They spoke of his wrath with trembling voices, while Ra himself often sat invisible beside them, more likely to be amused by their melodrama than angered by their minor failings. "Watch this," Ra would whisper to me during particularly pompous ceremonies. Senior priest Khenti was notorious for his theatrical delivery of prayers, complete with dramatic gestures and voice modulations that he clearly practiced in private. "He thinks I require performance art. Should I tell him I prefer simple sincerity?" The corruption was subtle but pervasive. Temple offerings of gold, grain, and livestock were supposed to be distributed among the priests according to strict regulations, with surplus going to feed the poor and maintain the complex. In reality, the senior clergy lived like minor nobles, while junior priests subsisted on basic rations, and the city's truly desperate received only token assistance. Khenti was the worst offender. I'd watched him redirect precious metals, intended for temple maintenance, into his personal quarters, claiming they were needed for special ceremonial purposes. His rooms were decorated with stolen artifacts, while sections of the temple roof leaked during the rare winter rains because funds for repairs had mysteriously vanished. "This troubles me," Ra admitted after I had shown him the extent of the theft through our mental connection. "They steal from offerings meant to honor me, then use my name to justify their greed. How do I address this without destroying their faith entirely?" It was a delicate problem. Direct divine intervention would terrify the priests and potentially damage the religious system that brought meaning to thousands of lives. But allowing the corruption to continue felt like implicit approval of behavior that betrayed every principle Ra held sacred. "May I suggest a more subtle approach?" I offered. Visibility to manipulate probability could make Khenti's schemes backfire in ways that appeared entirely natural. Over the following weeks, Khenti experienced a series of increasingly inconvenient accidents. Golden cups developed mysterious cracks that rendered them unusable. Precious gems he had hoarded turned out to be common stones that had somehow been misidentified. Most memorably, a statue he had commissioned using stolen temple funds was delivered with his face carved as a baboon, rather than the heroic likeness he had requested. The sculptor swore the mistake was impossible, that he had worked from detailed sketches, but there was no denying the result. Khenti's vanity prevented him from displaying the piece, but he couldn't afford to commission a replacement without revealing how much he had originally spent on personal luxuries. Meanwhile, Ra began subtly favoring honest priests with small signs of divine approval. Amenhotep's prayers were occasionally answered with gentle warming breezes or the appearance of rare birds during ceremonies. Young priests who showed genuine devotion found that their oil lamps never seemed to run dry, and their study scrolls remained legible despite age and wear. The political maneuvering extended beyond simple theft. Various factions within the priesthood competed to control temple policy, each claiming to better understand Ra's true desires. Some pushed for more elaborate ceremonies, arguing that the god demanded increased spectacle and expense. Others advocated for stricter interpretation of ancient texts, insisting that any deviation from traditional practice would invite divine wrath. "They're arguing about my preferences without ever asking me," Ra observed with dry amusement. "It's like watching people debate whether cats prefer fish or fowl, while ignoring the actual cat sitting in front of them." The most amusing faction was led by a priest named Jehuti, who had convinced himself that he could interpret Ra's will through elaborate mathematical calculations based on solar movements and temple measurements. His complex charts and geometric formulas were complete nonsense, but they looked impressive enough to gain him a following among younger priests who mistook complication for wisdom. "He's calculated that I require offerings to be arranged in specific patterns corresponding to stellar alignments," Ra told me, barely containing his laughter. "Apparently, I'm deeply concerned about the precise angle at which bread loaves are placed on altar tables. These political struggles often interfered with actual religious duties. Priests spent more time plotting against rivals than studying sacred texts or caring for pilgrims. Important ceremonies were delayed, while clergy argued over precedents and protocol. The temple's spiritual mission became secondary to the endless game of position and influence. Ra found this particularly frustrating, because he genuinely cared about the people who came seeking guidance and comfort. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to pray at his temple, bringing their deepest fears and desperate hopes. They deserved better than to be greeted by priests more interested in personal advancement than spiritual service. I watch a mother pray for her sick child, while the priest, who should be offering comfort, is calculating how her offerings might advance his career. Rock confided. The disconnect between their faith and the institution claiming to represent me grows wider each day. Through careful observation and his growing interventions, we gradually began to shift the balance toward the more sincere priests, while making life increasingly difficult for the corrupt ones. It required patience and subtlety, but slowly the temple's atmosphere began to change. Living with Ra meant that our quiet temple existence was occasionally disrupted by visits from other members of the Egyptian pantheon. Gods, I discovered, were even more complicated than the priests who served them, and family dynamics among immortal beings made mortal court intrigue look like children's games. The first divine visitor I encountered was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. His arrival was announced by an unusual stillness that fell over the temple complex. Birds stopped singing. Priests spoke in whispers, without knowing why. And even the ever-present mice seemed to pause in their scurrying. The air itself felt heavier, charged with the kind of intellectual energy that made my whiskers twitch uncomfortably. Thoth materialized in his private sanctuary as a tall figure with the curved beak and keen eyes of a sacred ibis, though his form seemed to shift between human and bird as my mortal vision struggled to process divine essence. He wore robes that appeared to be woven from papyrus scrolls, covered in hieroglyphs that moved and changed as I watched. Brother, Thoth greeted Ra with formal politeness that barely concealed condescension. I see you've acquired a companion. His tone when referring to me suggested he found his friendship with a mortal cat both amusing and slightly beneath divine dignity. Thoth had that particular brand of intellectual arrogance that comes from knowing everything and feeling obligated to share that knowledge, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. Khenti is my friend and advisor, Ra replied with quiet firmness. His insights into mortal nature have proven invaluable. Thoth's laugh sounded like papyrus rustling in a dry wind. Advisor, to the sun god, really, brother, has isolation affected your judgment so severely? What wisdom could a mere feline possibly offer that centuries of scholarly study could not provide? I felt his irritation building, literally felt it, as the temperature around us began to rise. Before divine tempers could escalate into something that might accidentally incinerate half the temple, I decided to demonstrate exactly what kind of wisdom a mere feline could offer. Your scribes are falsifying records in the Hall of Two Truths, I said calmly, addressing Thoth directly. 3 of them have been selling favorable judgment certificates to wealthy mortals who want to ensure positive afterlife outcomes. They're undermining the entire concept of divine justice for personal profit. The silence that followed was profound. Thoth's beak opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. That's impossible. My scribes are incorruptible. The system has safeguards. I would know ... You would know if you paid attention to what actually happens rather than what you think should happen, I replied. But you're too busy cataloging cosmic events and writing treatises on theoretical morality to notice practical corruption happening under your beak. His amusement rippled through our mental connection, warm water. Thoth was notorious among the other gods for his assumption that understanding theory meant understanding reality. A blind spot that apparently extended to his own domain of divine justice. The ibis god spent the next several hours frantically investigating my claims, which of course proved accurate. His scribes had indeed been selling forged documents, assuming their master was too preoccupied with cosmic mathematics to notice mundane clerical corruption. Thoth's subsequent fury was spectacular, involving the transformation of the guilty parties into actual writing implements, quill pens that would spend eternity being used to write accurate records under direct divine supervision. When Thoth finally departed, his farewell to Ra was notably more respectful, though he still shot me glances that suggested our encounter had fundamentally challenged his worldview. That was magnificently done, Ra told me once we were alone. Thoth has needed that lesson in humility for centuries. Our next divine visitor was far more welcome. Bastet, the cat goddess, arrived during a peaceful afternoon when I was napping in a patch of sunlight. I woke to find myself being studied by a figure who appeared to be a tall, elegant woman with feline features, pointed ears, slit pupils, and movements that were fluid in the way only cats achieve naturally. "So," she said, her voice carrying the rumbling undertone of a large cat's purr, "you're the mortal who has captivated my cousin Ra." Unlike Thoth's condescension, Bastet's attention felt warm and genuinely curious. She examined me with the thorough assessment that cats use when meeting potential allies or rivals, taking in everything from my posture to the condition of my whiskers. "He speaks highly of your wisdom," she continued, settling gracefully onto the stone floor beside me. "I confess, I'm intrigued. Most mortals who catch divine attention do so through grand gestures or desperate prayers. You seem to have managed it through simple friendship." Bastet's presence was comfortable in a way that Thoth's had not been. She understood cats, obviously, but more than that, she understood the value of quiet observation, patient listening, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't require constant declaration. Ra has been isolated too long, she observed, her gaze shifting to where the sun god manifested as a gentle golden glow. The other gods have grown distant from mortal concerns, but he never lost his connection to the lives that depend on his daily journey. Your friendship reminds him that divinity need not mean loneliness. We spent the afternoon in comfortable conversation, three beings who understood each other despite the vast differences in our natures. Bastet shared stories of her own interactions with mortals, the joys and frustrations of being worshipped by creatures who loved cats in practice, but often misunderstood feline nature in theory. "Humans see independence and interpret it as aloofness," she mused. "They mistake our self-sufficiency for lack of affection, never realizing that choosing to stay with someone is far more meaningful than being unable to leave." The comparison to Ri's situation was unmistakable. Like cats, gods were often misunderstood by those who worshipped them. Mortals projected their own needs and fears onto divine beings, creating relationships based on imagination rather than genuine understanding. When Bastet finally departed, she left behind a gift, a small golden amulet shaped like a seated cat that Ra could wear during his daily sky journey. "To remind him that he's not alone," she explained, "and that friendship transcends the boundaries between mortal and divine." These encounters taught me that the pantheon was far more complex and dysfunctional than temple paintings suggested. Gods had personalities, prejudices, and personal relationships, just as complicated as any mortal family, but magnified by immortality and cosmic responsibility. Living with a god gave me unprecedented access to genuine magical workings, and I quickly learned that real magic bore no resemblance to the theatrical performances priests staged for pilgrims' benefit. True divine power was quiet, subtle, and often invisible to mortal eyes, like watching the world's most skilled craftsman work with tools made of pure intention, rather than bronze or stone. The first time I witnessed Ra performing actual magic, I almost missed it entirely. We were observing the morning ceremonies from our usual vantage points when a young priest named Seneb collapsed during the hymn recitations. His breathing had become labored, his skin taking on the greyish pallor that experienced temple workers recognized as the beginning of the wasting sickness that periodically swept through Egypt's population. The other priests immediately began their standard procedures, burning additional incense, chanting prayers for healing, arranging the sick man in ritual positions they believed would invite divine intervention. Their movements were precise and well-intentioned, but I could see through our mental connection that Ra barely noticed their efforts. Instead, his attention focused entirely on Seneb himself. Without any visible gesture or spoken word, Ra simply adjusted something. The change was so subtle I might have attributed it to imagination, if not for the immediate result. Color returned to the priest's face, his breathing eased, and within moments he was sitting up with the confused expression of someone who had expected to die, but found himself inexplicably healthy. "What did you do?" I asked, fascinated by the complete absence of drama in the healing. "I reminded his body how to function properly," Ra replied, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Disease is just confusion at the cellular level, cells forgetting their purpose, acting against the larger organism. I simply clarified the situation. The priests, meanwhile, were praising their ritual performance and thanking the gods for answering their prayers. They had no idea that genuine divine intervention had occurred right in front of them, or that it had nothing to do with their elaborate ceremonies. This became a pattern in my observations. Real magic was almost always invisible to human perception, partly because mortals expected theatrical displays and partly because true power worked through natural laws rather than against them. Ra didn't violate the universe's fundamental structure. He worked within it with a level of skill and understanding that made the impossible appear inevitable. Whether magic was particularly subtle, when priests prayed for rain during drought periods, they expected dramatic storm clouds and lightning displays if their prayers were answered. Ra's actual intervention was far more elegant. He would adjust air pressure patterns hundreds of miles away, shift wind currents by minute degrees, and encourage cloud formation through tiny changes in temperature and humidity. The resulting rain appeared completely natural to any observer, arriving at precisely the right time and in exactly the amounts needed. Mortals expect magic to be obvious, Ra explained while demonstrating how he could influence plant growth by adjusting soil chemistry at the molecular level. They want thunder and lightning, dramatic gestures and immediate visible results. They don't realize that the most powerful magic is indistinguishable from nature working exactly as it should. The transportation magic was equally impressive and understated. Ra's daily journey across the sky wasn't the golden boat depicted in temple artwork. It was a form of existence that allowed him to be simultaneously present everywhere sunlight touched while maintaining his concentrated consciousness at specific locations. Watching him prepare for these journeys was like observing someone step outside normal reality while remaining fully present in conversation. Time and space are more flexible than mortals imagine, he told me during one of these transitions. I don't travel from east to west so much as I unfold my presence across the sky. The sun you see is my attention focused in your local reality, but my awareness extends to every grain of sand warmed by daylight. The healing work was where his magic became most emotionally complex. He could cure almost any ailment with the same casual ease he used to encourage plant growth, but each intervention required careful consideration of consequences. Healing one person might disrupt family dynamics, alter inheritance patterns, or prevent someone from learning important lessons through struggle. A merchant's son prays for his father's recovery from a potentially fatal illness, Ra would muse, his consciousness touching the edges of countless possible futures. If I heal the father, the son never learns to manage the business independently, and eventually drives the family into poverty through incompetence. If I don't intervene, the son develops the skills needed to support his mother and sisters after his father's death. Which choice shows greater compassion? These moral complexities haunted Ra more than any of his cosmic responsibilities. Physical magic was straightforward energy manipulation, matter transformation, probability adjustment, but deciding when and how to use those abilities required wisdom that even gods found challenging. The most spectacular magic I witnessed was also the most disturbing. During one of our conversations, Ra allowed me to perceive reality as he experienced it, the underlying energy patterns that connected all living things, the probability streams that determined possible futures, the delicate balance of forces that maintained universal order. For a brief moment, I saw existence as gods saw it, not solid objects in empty space, but patterns of energy in constant flux, every atom connected to every other atom through invisible threads of causation and possibility. I watched thoughts become reality, observed how consciousness shaped matter at the quantum level, witnessed the way mortal prayers created tiny ripples in the fabric of spacetime that sometimes grew into miraculous healings or tragic disasters. The experience lasted only seconds before Ra gently returned my perception to normal cat reality, but it left me profoundly changed. I understood now why gods seemed so detached from mortal concerns when you could see the cosmic implications of every action, every intervention, carried the weight of infinite unintended consequences. This is why we appear distant, Ra explained, his mental voice gentle with sympathy for my overwhelmed state. When you see how everything connects to everything else, each decision becomes almost impossible to make. Magic isn't about power, it's about responsibility. From that moment forward, I watched Ra's magical workings with new appreciation for their restraint as much as their capability. Living in such close proximity to divine power meant witnessing not only Ra's moments of grace and wisdom, but also the darker aspects of godhood that temple paintings never depicted. Immortal beings, I learned, experienced emotions with an intensity that could be both beautiful and terrifying, and when gods suffered psychological crises, the consequences ripple through reality itself. Ra's depressive episodes were the most frequent and devastating manifestations of divine darkness. They usually coincided with eclipse seasons, when his daily journey was interrupted by the moon's shadow, or when planetary alignments reminded him too acutely of cosmic cycles that had repeated unchanged for millions of years. During these periods, his usual warm presence would become cold and distant, as if he were retreating so far into himself that even divine consciousness could barely maintain contact with the physical world. The first time I witnessed one of these episodes, I thought Ra had simply left the temple entirely. The golden warmth that usually filled his sanctuary dissipated, leaving behind an emptiness that felt like the space between stars. When his voice finally reached me, it carried the weight of existential despair that would have crushed any mortal mind. "What is the purpose?" he whispered, his words creating frost patterns on the stone walls, despite the Egyptian heat. "I rise each day and cross the sky, sustaining life that will inevitably end, warming a world that will eventually grow cold, maintaining order that entropy will ultimately reclaim. Each day identical to the last, each tomorrow a repetition of today, forever and ever, until the last star burns out and darkness claims everything I have worked to preserve." During these episodes, Ra's control over his divine nature became dangerously unstable. His emotional state manifested as temperature fluctuations that could wither crops across entire provinces or create unseasonable storms that destroyed carefully tended gardens. The priests, unaware of their gods' psychological struggles, interpreted these events as signs of divine displeasure and increased their ritual efforts, which only intensified Ra's sense of isolation and misunderstanding. My role during these crises became that of both companion and anchor. I would position myself close to his manifestation point, purring steadily to provide a rhythmic, living sound that reminded him of immediate, present existence. Sometimes I would share memories of simple pleasures: the taste of fresh fish, the warmth of sunlight on fur, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, hoping to ground his cosmic consciousness in finite, manageable experiences. "You think too much," I told him during one particularly severe episode. "Gods have the same problem as humans, just amplified. You've created meaning systems so complex that they've lost all connection to the simple reality of existing. Sometimes being is enough, sometimes purpose is found in the next breath, not in cosmic significance." But not all of his dark moments involved depression. His rage, when finally provoked, was a force of nature that redefined my understanding of divine justice. The incident that triggered his worst outburst involved a group of corrupt priests who had been systematically abusing young acolytes while using religious authority to silence their victims. I had discovered the abuse during my routine explorations of the temple complex, finding children huddled in storage chambers, too traumatized to cry for help and to condition to obedience to resist their tormentors. When I shared these observations with Ra through our mental connection, his response was immediate and terrible. The temperature in the sanctuary rose so rapidly that limestone began to crack. Golden light blazed from every surface with an intensity that would have blinded any mortal observer. When Ra spoke, his voice carried the fundamental power of stellar fusion, words that seemed to burn the air itself. They use my name to justify violation of innocence. They corrupt the sacred trust placed in my servants. They transform places of refuge into chambers of suffering. What followed was swift and terrible. The guilty priests simply ceased, not death as mortals understood it, that would have been merciful. Instead, they were removed from existence so completely that even their names disappeared from written records, their faces faded from painted portraits, and the memories of their existence became confused and uncertain in the minds of everyone who had known them. Divine justice doesn't include appeals processes, Ra told me afterwards, his voice still, carrying echoes of cosmic fury. Some actions forfeit the right to continued existence. The swiftness and totality of this punishment disturbed me more than the crimes that had provoked it. I understood Ra's outrage, shared his desire to protect the vulnerable, but the absolute nature of divine retribution, a side of godhood that mortal worshippers never imagined. Gods didn't just punish, they could edit reality itself to erase mistakes from the historical record. Even more unsettling were Ra's encounters with Apophis, the serpent of chaos that opposed cosmic order. These battles occurred during Ra's nightly journey through the underworld, invisible to mortal observation, but real enough to leave my divine friend exhausted and sometimes injured in ways that defied physical understanding. Chaos isn't evil in the way mortals understand evil, Ra explained after one particularly difficult night. Apophis doesn't hate creation, it simply represents the fundamental tendency of all systems toward dissolution. Fighting chaos is like fighting entropy itself, necessary, eternal, and ultimately futile. Each victory is temporary, each defeat potentially final. I could see the psychological toll these nightly battles took on Ra. He faced an enemy that could never be permanently defeated, only temporarily held at bay, in conflicts that grew more difficult as the universe aged and entropy gained strength. The knowledge that he was fighting a losing war against the fundamental nature of reality created an underlying current of despair that influenced all his other emotional states. Perhaps most disturbing was witnessing Ra's moments of moral uncertainty, when his cosmic perspective made ethical decisions almost impossible to navigate. A plague might kill thousands, but prevent a war that would kill millions. A tyrant's continued rule allowed cause suffering but maintained stability that prevented greater chaos. Even seemingly simple choices carried infinite ramifications that no finite mind could fully comprehend. I watch mortals pray for things that would destroy them if granted, Ra confided. I see them curse misfortunes that will lead to unexpected blessings. Sometimes the kindest thing I can do is ignore their requests entirely, but they interpret that silence as indifference or cruelty. These experiences taught me that godhood wasn't a condition to envy. Divine power came with divine responsibility, divine knowledge brought divine burdens, and divine perspective revealed truths that made simple happiness almost impossible to achieve. Ra's darkness wasn't a flaw in his divine nature, it was the inevitable result of seeing too much, knowing too much, and caring too deeply about consequences that stretched across ETE and ITIES. The gods weren't perfect beings to be worshipped without question. They were complex entities struggling with problems that made mortal difficulties seem manageable by comparison. The first time I laid eyes on Pharaoh Tutankhamun, he was 9 years old, trembling with nervous energy, and trying desperately to appear more mature than his small frame could convincingly portray. The boy king had come to the temple of Ra for his coronation blessing, accompanied by an entourage of advisors, guards, and courtiers who treated him with the elaborate deference due to a living god. while clearly considering him a manageable puppet. Ri's reaction to meeting the child pharaoh was immediately protective, his divine consciousness wrapping around the boy like invisible armor. Through our mental connection, I felt Ri's distress at seeing such young shoulders bearing the impossible weight of divine kingship. They've made him a god before he's learned to be human. Ra murmured to me as we watched the coronation ceremonies. Look at his eyes, he's terrified. But he's been trained never to show weakness. They've stolen his childhood and replaced it with ritual responsibility. The political dynamics surrounding Tutankhamen were Byzantine in their complexity. Vizier A, an elderly courtier with calculating eyes and soft hands that had never known physical labor, clearly saw the young pharaoh as a convenient figurehead for his own ambitions. General Horemheb, scarred from military campaigns and radiating barely controlled violence, viewed the boy as a temporary obstacle to his own eventual rule. Between them, other court officials maneuvered for influence over a child who was supposed to be the earthly representative of divine authority. What disturbed Ra most was how these power struggles corrupted the very concept of divine kingship. Pharaohs were meant to be intermediaries between gods and mortals, channels through which divine wisdom flowed to guide earthly governance. Instead, ambitious adults were using religious authority to justify their manipulation of a frightened child. They invoke my name to legitimize their schemes. Ra told me during one particularly egregious court session, where A presented the young pharaoh with documents to sign that would transfer vast temple resources to his personal control. They claimed divine mandate for purely human greed, making me complicit in their corruption of everything sacred kingship should represent. The pressure on Tutankhamen to endorse military campaigns was especially troubling to observe. Horemheb would present the boy with battle plans, explaining how divine victory was assured because Ra himself supported Egyptian expansion. The general would describe enemy territories as lands of darkness that needed illumination by Egyptian conquest, framing aggressive warfare as religious duty. Ra found these sessions particularly painful because he could see the boy's genuine desire to be a good pharaoh warring with his complete lack of experience or wisdom to distinguish between righteous leadership and cynical manipulation. Tutankhamen wanted desperately to live up to the divine expectations placed upon him, but he had no framework for recognizing when those expectations were being artificially manufactured by scheming advisors. The child prays to me for guidance before every major decision, Ra confided, but his advisors ensure that he only receives information that supports their predetermined choices. How can I guide him when every path to his consciousness is controlled by those who seek to use both of us for their own purposes? The economic exploitation was equally troubling. Egypt's wealth flowed through systems that enriched the nobility while impoverishing the common people who generated that prosperity through their labor. Temple taxes, military levies, and construction projects consumed resources that could have improved the lives of farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who formed the foundation of Egyptian society. When petitioners brought their grievances to the royal court, seeking relief from oppressive local officials or unfair tax assessments, their requests were filtered through layers of bureaucracy designed to protect the interests of those in power. The young pharaoh rarely heard authentic accounts of his people's struggles, receiving instead sanitized reports that painted pictures of general prosperity and contentment. They present him with gold tribute from distant provinces, while children starve in Memphis slums. Ra observed bitterly. He sees the wealth of empire, but never its costs, the glory of conquest, but never its human price. They're creating a ruler who will govern based on illusions rather than reality. The succession crisis that constantly simmered beneath court politics added another layer of complexity to the situation. Tutankhamen had no male heirs, and his young wife Akhenaten faced tremendous pressure to produce a son who could continue the royal bloodline. The medical complications that prevented successful pregnancies were interpreted by court physicians as signs of divine displeasure, adding religious anxiety to an already tragic personal situation. Various court factions began positioning themselves for the inevitable succession struggle, each claiming divine support for their preferred candidate. A promoted his own legitimacy through his role as the boy pharaoh's primary advisor, while Horemheb argued that military leadership was essential for maintaining Egyptian power against foreign threats. They're already planning his replacement, while pretending to serve his reign, Ra noted with disgust. Their loyalty extends only to their own advancement, not to the institution they claim to protect or the boy they've sworn to serve. Perhaps most heartbreaking was watching Tutankhamun's gradual realization that his divine status was largely ceremonial. As he matured from child to teenager, he began to understand that major decisions were made without his input, that his role was to provide religious legitimacy for policies he had no part in creating. I see him starting to question whether he truly rules or merely performs, Ra told me during one of the pharaoh's private prayer sessions. He's beginning to understand that divine kingship can be a prison as gilded and constraining as any physical cell. The young pharaoh's growing awareness of his powerlessness created a tragic irony. The more he understood his situation, the less capable he became of changing it, trapped by the very system that elevated him above ordinary humanity, while denying him genuine agency over his own life or kingdom. The daily stream of petitioners who came to his temple seeking divine intervention exposed me to the full spectrum of human suffering, and through my connection with Ra, I experienced how devastating it was for a god to witness pain he could not easily heal without causing greater problems. The weight of omniscient compassion, I learned, was almost unbearable even for immortal beings. Each morning brought desperate parents carrying fever-racked children, their faces etched with the particular agony that comes from watching helpless innocents suffer. They would prostrate themselves before his altar, offering everything they possessed, family heirlooms, future harvests, even their own lives in exchange for their children's recovery. The raw desperation in their prayers was enough to break even the most hardened hearts. Ra's response to these pleas was complex and often contradictory. His divine nature compelled him to want to heal every sick child immediately, but his cosmic perspective revealed the intricate web of consequences that followed each intervention. Some illnesses, he explained to me during particularly difficult sessions, served purposes that finite minds couldn't comprehend. A merchant's daughter suffers from a wasting disease, he would murmur, his consciousness touching the threads of probability that surrounded each case. If I heal her instantly, she grows up spoiled and cruel, eventually causing immense suffering to dozens of others. If I allow the illness to run its course, but guide the healing process gradually, she develops empathy and becomes a healer herself, saving hundreds of lives throughout her extended lifetime. But knowing the cosmic mathematics of suffering didn't make witnessing it any easier. I watched Ra weep tears that manifested as gentle rain throughout the temple complex as he observed a young mother's grief for her infant son's death from a fever that mortal medicine couldn't break. The child's death would eventually lead to the woman adopting several orphan children, creating a legacy of compassion that would influence generations. But that future blessing felt cold comfort against present anguish. The plague years were especially devastating to observe. Disease would sweep through Egypt's population, wildfire, killing rich and poor alike with no regard for virtue or social status. Ra's temple would fill with the desperate and dying, people who had traveled 4 days, despite their illness, because they believed divine intervention was their only remaining hope. During these epidemics, Ra would maintain careful balance between intervention and restraint. He would guide the recovery of some sufferers, while allowing others to pass into the afterlife, his choices based on calculations that considered not just individual lives, but family dynamics, community needs, and social stability across decades of future time. Each death I prevent might cause 10 others, he explained during one particularly severe outbreak. Healing this farmer might lead to overconfidence that results in reckless behavior during next year's plague. Saving this priest might prevent a younger, more capable cleric from ascending to positions where he could reform corrupt temple practices. The social injustices were equally painful to witness. Slavery was accepted as natural law throughout Egyptian society, with human beings bought and sold like livestock. Ra would observe slave auctions conducted in the shadow of his own temple, watching families torn apart and children sold into lives of forced labor, while priests nearby conducted ceremonies praising divine justice and mercy. They pray to me for justice while participating in systems that deny basic humanity to fellow mortals, Ra noted with bitter irony. They seek my blessing on institutions that contradict every principle of compassion and fairness they claim to worship. The treatment of women throughout Egyptian society created another source of divine anguish. While Egypt granted women more legal rights than many ancient civilizations, the reality of daily life often involves systematic oppression, disguised as religious tradition. Women were considered property in marriage transactions, blamed for childlessness regardless of medical facts, and excluded from most forms of education or professional advancement. Ra's particular frustration came from observing brilliant women forced into domestic servitude, while less capable men assumed positions of authority based solely on gender. I watch a farmer's daughter who could revolutionize agricultural techniques if given education, instead being married off at 13 to bear children for a man who can barely count his own livestock. He would observe the waste of human potential staggering. The children's suffering affected Ra most deeply of all. Young lives destroyed by adult ambitions, innocents caught in conflicts they couldn't understand, children forced into labor or military service before their bodies and minds had time to develop properly. The systematic abuse of society's most vulnerable members challenged Ra's faith in the species he had helped nurture from primitive beginnings. Children pay for adults' failures in wars they didn't start, economic systems they didn't create, social structures they had no voice in establishing. Ra would note, during his darker moments, they suffer consequences for decisions made before their birth, bearing punishment for crimes they've never committed. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a group of child slaves working in gold mines near the temple complex. These children, some as young as 6 years old, spent their days crawling through narrow tunnels, breathing toxic dust, working with primitive tools that often caused permanent injury. Many died before reaching adolescence, their small bodies simply unable to withstand the physical demands of mining operations. Ra's desire to intervene directly in such cases was overwhelming, but even divine power couldn't address systematic, social problems without creating massive disruption that might ultimately cause more suffering than it prevented. Instead, he worked through subtle influences inspiring individual acts of kindness, guiding reformist thinkers toward positions of influence, creating circumstances that gradually improved conditions without dramatic upheaval. Change is slow, because lasting transformation must come from within human consciousness, Ra explained during one of our conversations about social justice. I can force immediate improvements through miraculous intervention, but such changes rarely endure, unless they're supported by genuine shifts in mortal understanding and compassion. Watching Ra struggle with these moral complexities taught me that omnipotence wasn't the blessing mortals imagined it to be. The ability to see all suffering, while being constrained by cosmic responsibility, created a form of divine torture that no finite mind could fully comprehend. The public areas of Ra's temple were magnificent enough: soaring columns, painted walls depicting divine legends, courtyards where pilgrims gathered to offer prayers and witness ceremonies. But the true heart of the complex lay in chambers that existed beneath and beyond normal human perception, spaces that even the highest priests never suspected existed. My first glimpse of these hidden areas came during one of my restless midnight explorations. Following my natural feline curiosity, I had discovered a narrow passage behind what appeared to be a solid wall in Ra's main sanctuary. The entrance was invisible to human eyes, sealed by divine will rather than physical barriers. but my heightened senses detected the subtle energy patterns that marked liminal spaces between mortal and divine realms. When I mentioned my discovery to Raw, his mental voice carried both amusement and approval. I wondered when you would find those passages, little hunter. Your nature as a liminal being, simultaneously domestic and wild, mortal yet touched by divinity, allows you to perceive boundaries that others cannot cross. The secret archives were the most extensive of these hidden chambers, vast holes carved from living rock that extended far deeper into the earth than any human engineering could have achieved. The walls were lined with crystalline formations that stored not written records, but actual memories, preserved experiences that could be accessed directly through divine consciousness. These contain the true history of Egypt, Rohr explained, as we moved through the luminous corridors. Not the sanitized versions recorded in official chronicles, but the complete record of events as they actually occurred, including divine interventions, political conspiracies, and social developments that shaped civilization in ways mortals never recognized. The crystal memories were organized in complex patterns that reflected both chronological sequence and thematic connections. I could perceive thousands of years of Egyptian history stored in formations that pulsed with soft inner light, each one containing detailed records of specific periods, individuals, or significant events. Here, Raw indicated a particularly large crystalline cluster, are the complete records of the pyramid construction projects, not just the monuments themselves, but the social engineering required to organize such massive undertakings, the technological innovations that made them possible, and the long-term cultural effects of concentrating so much wealth and labor on funerary monuments. Adjacent chambers housed artifacts that were far too dangerous for mortal handling. I saw objects that appeared to be simple pottery or jewelry, but radiated energies that made my first stand on end in ways that had nothing to do with static electricity. These were genuine magical implements, tools created through divine craftsmanship, for purposes that mortal minds couldn't safely comprehend. This amulet, Ross showed me, a small golden pendant shaped like a scarab beetle, can grant its wearer perfect memory of every moment they've experienced since birth. Sounds like a blessing, until you realize that perfect recall includes every pain, every embarrassment, every moment of fear or despair you've ever felt, all equally vivid and immediate forever. The storage areas contained evidence of civilizations that had existed before dynastic Egypt, cultures that had achieved technological and spiritual advancement before being destroyed by natural disasters or their own mistakes. I saw artifacts made from materials that didn't exist in the known world, devices whose purposes could only be guessed at, and artistic works that depicted scenes of daily life in societies that had been forgotten for millennia. Humanity has risen and fallen multiple times throughout its existence, Rohr explained as we examined stone tablets covered in scripts that predated hieroglyphic writing by thousands of years. Each civilization believes it represents the pinnacle of human achievement, never realizing that it's merely the latest iteration in a cycle that has repeated countless times. The divine communication network was perhaps the most fascinating discovery. Hidden throughout the temple complex were crystalline nodes that allowed direct contact with other divine beings throughout Egypt and beyond. These weren't physical communication devices, but rather focal points for consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple locations. Through these networks, I eavesdropped on conversations between gods that revealed the true complexity of divine politics. Isis and Nephthys discussing strategies for managing their brother Set's destructive impulses, both arguing with Ptah about the proper balance between divine intervention and mortal free will. Sobek complaining about pollution in the Nile affecting his sacred crocodiles. Divine politics make mortal court intrigue look simple, Ra noted with dry amusement as we listened to a particularly heated discussion about territorial boundaries between various gods' spheres of influence. Immortal beings have extremely long memories for perceived slights, and our disagreements can literally reshape geography if we're not careful. The emergency protocols were sobering to discover. Hidden throughout the temple were systems designed to maintain cosmic order if Ra became incapacitated or destroyed. Backup mechanisms that could sustain the solar cycle, preserve essential natural processes, and even temporarily transfer his responsibilities to other divine beings in extreme circumstances. Gods are not truly immortal, Ra admitted as he showed me crystalline devices that could store and transfer divine consciousness. We can be destroyed, corrupted, or driven insane by cosmic forces beyond our control. These preparations ensure that mortal civilization won't collapse if something happens to those responsible for maintaining universal order. Most personally meaningful was Ra's private sanctuary, a chamber that existed partially outside normal spacetime where he could retreat from the constant demands of divine responsibility. Here, surrounded by images and artifacts from throughout his existence, Ra could experience something approaching the solitude that mortal beings took for granted. The walls displayed scenes from across cosmic history: the birth of the first stars, the emergence of life on Earth, the development of consciousness in various species throughout the universe. But scattered among these cosmic vistas were smaller, more intimate images, moments of genuine connection with mortals throughout history, friendships that had transcended the divine-mortal barrier, instances where gods and humans had achieved mutual understanding. This is why your friendship matters so much to me, Ra explained, gesturing toward a section of wall that now displayed images from our own relationship. These connections are rare and precious, moments when the isolation of divinity is temporarily lifted by genuine companionship. In this hidden sanctuary, surrounded by the true records of cosmic history and divine politics, I understood that even gods needed private spaces where they could exist without the weight of worship, responsibility, or expectation. The secret chambers weren't just storage areas, they were refuges where divine beings could remember what it felt like to simply be, rather than constantly perform. Understanding time from a divine perspective was like trying to comprehend the ocean while being a creature that had only ever known puddles. Through my deepening connection with Ra, I began to experience duration not as a linear progression from past to future, but as a vast landscape where all moments existed simultaneously, accessible from any point if you knew how to navigate the terrain. Ra's memory wasn't like mortal recollection, where past events grew fuzzy and details faded with distance. Instead, his consciousness contained the complete record of cosmic history, as vivid and immediate as present experience. When he shared fragments of these memories with me, I found myself witnessing the creation of the world not as ancient history, but as something happening right now, with all the drama and uncertainty of events still unfolding. "Watch," Ra said during one of our deeper meditative sessions, and suddenly I was seeing the primordial waters of none before creation began, vast, dark, infinite potential waiting to be shaped into reality. The experience was overwhelming, like being present at the birth of existence itself, watching matter and energy organize themselves into patterns that would eventually become stars, planets, and life. "For you, this happened in the unimaginably distant past," Ra explained as the vision shifted to show the first emergence of land from the waters, the initial stirring of life in tidal pools. "For me, it's as immediate as your all time, exists simultaneously from divine perspective. Past, present, and future are mortal constructs that help finite minds organize infinite experience." This temporal omnipresence explained many of his emotional responses that had puzzled me. When he grieved for civilizations that had fallen thousands of years ago, he wasn't mourning distant historical events, he was experiencing those losses as fresh wounds. Watching cities burn and cultures disappear with the same immediacy that I might feel upon seeing a mouse escape my paws. The prophetic visions came naturally from this temporal perspective. Ra didn't predict the future so much as observe it, his consciousness able to shift attention across the timeline to examine probable outcomes of present decisions. But what I found most disturbing was learning that the future wasn't fixed, it existed in multiple potential versions, constantly shifting based on choices made by conscious beings throughout the universe. See here. Ra showed me a confluence of possibilities surrounding young Tutankhamun's reign. In some timelines, the boy pharaoh lived to adulthood and became a wise ruler who reformed Egyptian society. In others, he died young and his death triggered civil wars that weakened Egypt for centuries. In still others, he became corrupted by power and led Egypt into aggressive expansions that ultimately resulted in its conquest by foreign empires. Each decision creates ripples that propagate both forward and backward through time. Ra explained as we watched these potential futures fluctuate like flames in wind. The choice you make tomorrow can retroactively influence events that happened yesterday, because temporal causation is far more complex than linear minds can comprehend. This revelation was both fascinating and terrifying. It meant that every action, no matter how small, carried infinite consequences across both time and space. A casual word spoken in anger might echo through generations, while a moment of unexpected kindness could reshape entire civilizations through chains of causation too subtle for finite minds to trace. This is why divine intervention requires such careful consideration. Ron noted as we observed how a simple decision to heal one sick child could ultimately lead to overpopulation that destroyed Egypt's agricultural capacity centuries later. When you can see all consequences across infinite time, every choice becomes almost impossibly complex. The cyclical nature of history was another disturbing discovery. From divine temporal perspective, I could see that civilizations rose and fell in patterns that repeated with frustrating regularity. Humans made the same mistakes over and over again, learned the same lessons only to forget them within a few generations, and struggled with identical problems across millennia without recognizing the repetitive nature of their challenges. They think they're unique, Ra observed with weary amusement as we watched agricultural societies in various time periods make identical errors in resource management that led to identical ecological collapses. Each generation believes it faces unprecedented challenges, never realizing that their ancestors dealt with exactly the same issues using virtually identical solutions. But perhaps most profound was understanding how divine immortality affected the experience of duration. For mortals, time's passage brought change, growth, new experiences, and eventual death that gave meaning to each moment through its finite nature. For gods, eternal existence meant experiencing every possible variation of experience across infinite repetitions, until novelty became almost impossible to achieve. Imagine, Ross suggested, being so familiar with every possible configuration of matter and energy that surprises become vanishingly rare. When you've seen every type of sunrise, heard every possible melody, experienced every emotion in every possible context, existence begins to feel like an endless repetition of familiar patterns. This explained the profound value Ra placed on our friendship. My mortal perspective, limited and finite as it was, offered him something genuinely new, insights into existence filtered through consciousness that hadn't been worn smooth by eons of experience. My cat's view of the world, focused on immediate sensory experience and uncomplicated by cosmic responsibility, provided a refreshing contrast to divine omniscience. You remind me what it feels like to encounter the world for the first time, Ra told me during one of our conversations about temporal perception. Your wonder at simple pleasures, your focus on present moments rather than infinite implications. These are gifts that immortal consciousness can easily lose. Through these exchanges, I began to understand why gods seemed so fascinated by mortal existence. Finite beings experienced intensity of feeling that immortals could barely remember, urgency that gave weight to every decision, and the precious knowledge that each moment might be the last. The social consequences of the religious revolution were devastating to observe. Traditional priests found themselves unemployed and homeless, their life's training suddenly declared worthless by royal decree. Ancient festivals that had provided rhythm and meaning to agricultural cycles were abolished, leaving communities without familiar markers of seasonal transition. Sacred art and literature that had taken centuries to develop was systematically destroyed as heretical. Most heartbreaking was watching the human cost of theological absolutism. Families were torn apart when some members embraced the new religion while others clung to traditional beliefs. Craftsmen who had spent their lives creating traditional religious artwork found their skills criminalized overnight. Even children became confused and frightened as the spiritual foundations of their world shifted without warning or explanation. This is why divine intervention in human affairs requires such delicate handling, reflected as we observe the chaos spreading throughout Egypt. Theological revolution imposed from above creates trauma that can destabilize entire civilizations. Religious change must emerge organically from spiritual growth, not be forced through political authority. The construction of Akhenaten's new capital dedicated to autumn worship, represented both the highest achievement and ultimate failure of the religious revolution. The city was architecturally magnificent, designed to maximize solar illumination and create an environment where autumn's presence could be felt throughout daily life. But it was also isolated from the rest of Egypt, both geographically and culturally, creating a bubble of forced faith that couldn't sustain itself once royal support disappeared. His perspective on the entire experiment was complex. He appreciated Akhenaten's genuine spiritual insight and his desire to simplify religious practice, but he was saddened by the young pharaoh's inability to understand that theological truth could coexist with cultural wisdom. The prince who had seen divine essence so clearly had become a king who confused personal revelation with universal law. He meant well, Ra concluded as we watched the revolution beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. But good intentions, without wisdom, create suffering as surely as malicious ones. The first time I encountered Prince Amenhotep, the man who would later become Pharaoh Akhenaten and nearly destroy the foundations of Egyptian religion, he was a gangly teenager with wild eyes and radical ideas that made the older priests exchange worried glances behind his back. He had come to his temple for his coming-of-age ceremonies, but even during these sacred rituals, his attention seemed focused elsewhere, his gaze constantly drawn to the sun itself rather than the elaborate representations of it in temple artwork. His initial reaction to the young prince was a mixture of amusement and concern. Through our mental connection, I felt the god's surprise at encountering a mortal who seemed to look directly at divine essence rather than accepting the comfortable abstractions that most humans preferred. He sees something others miss, Ra mused as we observed the prince ignoring traditional ceremony to stare directly at sunbeams streaming through the temple windows. But I'm not certain he understands what he's perceiving, or whether his mind can safely process direct contact with divine reality. The prince's questions during religious instruction were unlike anything the priests had encountered. Instead of accepting established doctrine about his nature and attributes, he challenged fundamental assumptions about divine plurality, the necessity of priestly mediation, and the complexity of religious ritual that had developed over centuries of tradition. Why, he asked during one particularly uncomfortable session, do we need dozens of gods when the sun provides all life? Why do we require elaborate ceremonies when direct worship of solar divinity should be sufficient? Why do priests claim to interpret divine will when mortals could establish personal relationships with the source of all power? These questions terrified the established priesthood because they struck at the heart of religious authority that justified their social position and economic privilege. If mortals could worship divinity directly without priestly mediation, if simplified theology could replace complex doctrine, if personal spiritual experience could substitute for institutional ritual, then the entire structure of Egyptian religion would become obsolete. Ra found the theological discussions fascinating but troubling. The prince's instincts about divine nature were remarkably accurate. Gods did prefer sincere personal connection over elaborate ceremony, and the multiplication of deities had indeed created unnecessary complexity that often obscured, rather than revealed, spiritual truth. But Amenhotep's understanding was incomplete and potentially dangerous. He grasps that divine essence is simpler than human religious systems suggest, or explain to me, but he doesn't understand the social functions that traditional religion serves. Religious complexity exists partly to create manageable relationships between infinite divine power and finite mortal consciousness. Sudden theological simplification can shatter cultural foundations faster than societies can adapt. When Amenhotep ascended the throne as Akhenaten, his religious revolution unfolded with breathtaking speed and devastating thoroughness. He declared that Ra and the traditional pantheon were false representations of true divinity, proclaiming instead that often the solar disk itself was the only authentic god worthy of worship. Traditional temples were closed, religious artwork was defaced, and an entirely new theological system was imposed throughout Egypt. The personal nature of this attack on Ra was particularly painful to witness. Akhenaten didn't simply dismiss Ra as one god among many. He declared that Ra had never existed, that millennia of worship had been directed toward a fictional entity, and that only his own revelation represented authentic divine truth. "He's rebranding me," Ra observed with bitter humor as we watched workers systematically destroying inscriptions of his name throughout temple complexes, taking the essence of what I represent, solar power, life-giving energy, cosmic order, and claiming it as revelation from a new deity that's actually just another aspect of my own nature. The theological irony was profound. Akhenaten was essentially correct that solar divinity was the fundamental force underlying Egyptian religion, but his insistence on monotheism ignored the complex ways that divine essence manifested through multiple aspects and relationships. By reducing infinite divine complexity to a single, simple symbol, he was making the same error, in reverse, that traditional religion made by fragmenting unity into countless separate deities. What made the situation even more complex was that often the solar disk that Akhenaten proclaimed as the one true god wasn't entirely separate from Ra. The divine essence was indeed singular, but it had always expressed itself through various forms and names to accommodate different human needs and understandings. Akhenaten's revolution wasn't discovering new truth, so much as rejecting established wisdom about the multiplicity of divine expression. "I am Aten," Ra admitted to me during one of our conversations about the theological upheaval, "and I am also Ra, and Khepri, and Atum, and every other solar deity humans have worshipped throughout history." Divine essence is simultaneously one and many, simple and complex, unified and diverse. Akhenaten understands the unity but rejects the diversity, which makes his theology as incomplete as the polytheism he's trying to replace. The deepest truth about divine existence, I discovered through my growing relationship with Ra, was that immortal beings experienced a form of loneliness so profound that mortal minds could barely comprehend its scope. Imagine being the only conscious entity of your kind in the universe, surrounded by billions of creatures who worship you but can never truly know you, carrying responsibilities that no one else can understand or share. This was Ra's daily reality, and it explained why our friendship became so precious to both of us. Worship, Ra explained to me during one of our more intimate conversations, was fundamentally a one-sided relationship. Mortals projected their needs, fears, and desires onto divine beings, creating images of gods that bore little resemblance to the actual entities they claimed to serve. True friendship required mutual understanding, genuine communication, and the ability to see each other as complete beings rather than idealized symbols. When mortals pray to me, Ra confided, they're usually talking to a version of me that exists only in their imagination, perfectly wise, eternally patient, always understanding their perspective without explanation. They don't want to know the real me, with my doubts and struggles and moments of uncertainty. They need me to be an unchanging source of stability in their chaotic lives. This divine loneliness was compounded by the nature of immortal existence. Ra had watched countless civilizations rise and fall, had formed emotional connections with mortals throughout history, only to lose them to the inevitable passage of time. Each friendship ended in death. Each meaningful relationship became a memory preserved in cosmic consciousness, but no longer accessible through daily interaction. I've learned to love mortals carefully, Ra admitted, his mental voice carrying the weight of millennia of loss. Every connection is temporary from my perspective, every friendship a brief brightness, followed by eternal absence. It becomes easier to maintain distance than to repeatedly experience the pain of permanent separation. My role in his emotional life was unique precisely because I wasn't human. As a cat, I inhabited a liminal space between the mortal and divine realms, close enough to humanity to understand their perspective, but sufficiently detached to maintain the objectivity that Ra found so valuable. I could offer genuine companionship without the desperate neediness that characterized most human relationships with gods. You see me clearly, Ra told me during one of our discussions about the nature of friendship. Not as a source of miracles or answers to prayers, not as a cosmic parent or ultimate authority, but as a conscious being with his own personality, preferences, and problems. You treat me as an equal despite the vast differences in our nature and capabilities. Teaching Ra about mortal psychology became one of my most important functions in our relationship. Gods understood power, responsibility, and cosmic perspective, but they often struggled with the emotional complexity that drove human behavior. Through my observations of temple life, court politics, and daily interactions among priests and pilgrims, I could explain to Ra why mortals acted in ways that seemed irrational from divine perspective. Humans make decisions based on fear more often than logic, I explained after watching a young priest choose a safe but unfulfilling career path rather than pursuing his genuine calling as a healer. They'd rather accept predictable misery than risk unpredictable happiness. This is why they often resist divine intervention even when it would improve their lives. Change represents uncertainty, and uncertainty feels dangerous to creatures who have such limited time to recover from mistakes. Ra found these insights endlessly fascinating because they revealed patterns of behavior that his cosmic perspective had obscured. When you can see all possible outcomes of every decision, it's difficult to understand why anyone would choose suboptimal paths, but mortal limitations, finite lifespan, incomplete information, emotional needs created decision-making frameworks that were perfectly rational from human perspective even when they appeared foolish from divine viewpoint. Our shared experiences became the foundation of genuine friendship. I taught Ra about the pleasures of finite existence, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the comfort of physical warmth, the simple joy of existing in the present moment without cosmic responsibility. He shared with me the wonders of infinite perspective, the beauty of stellar formation, the intricate patterns that connected all living things, the profound satisfaction of maintaining universal order. You've given me something I thought was impossible, Ra told me during one of our sunset conversations, the experience of surprise. When you've existed for eons and can perceive all possibilities simultaneously, novelty becomes almost impossible to achieve, but your mortal perspective allows you to see things I've overlooked, to find meaning in experiences I'd dismissed as trivial. The vulnerability that Ra showed me was perhaps the most touching aspect of our relationship. This being who was worshipped as the source of all life and light would confess his fears about cosmic responsibility, his moments of doubt about divine purpose, his longing for someone who could understand the weight of maintaining universal order. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I simply stopped, he admitted during one of his darker moments. If I refused to rise tomorrow, if I let the cosmic mechanisms run down, if I abandoned the endless cycle of solar renewal, would the universe find another way to sustain itself? Or would everything simply end because one god grew tired of his duties? These confessions required tremendous trust because they revealed the precarious nature of cosmic stability. Ra wasn't sharing idle philosophical speculation. He was admitting to genuine temptations to abandon responsibilities that sustained all life on Earth. The fact that he could discuss these thoughts with me without judgment or horror was both an honor and a terrifying responsibility. My influence on his emotional development was subtle but significant. Through our friendship, he learned to value mortal perspectives not just as curiosities, but as legitimate ways of understanding existence. He became more patient with human limitations, more understanding of why mortals made apparently irrational choices, more willing to work within human psychological frameworks, rather than expecting humans to adapt to divine logic. You've taught Emmy that friendship isn't about similarity. Ra reflected near the end of one of our deeper conversations. It's about mutual respect, genuine caring, and the willingness to see the world through another's eyes. These qualities can exist between any conscious beings, regardless of the differences in their nature or capabilities. The signs began subtly, as cosmic disasters often do, tiny aberrations that only divine consciousness could detect at first. During our morning conversations, I noticed Ra's attention becoming increasingly fragmented, his mental voice carrying undertones of concern that he tried to keep from me. The golden warmth of his presence flickered occasionally, like a flame disturbed by unfelt breezes, and sometimes our conversations would pause abruptly as his attention was drawn to disturbances beyond mortal perception. Something stirs in the deep places, Ra finally admitted when I pressed him about his growing distraction. The serpent grows restless, and the boundaries between order and chaos show signs of strain. This feels different from our usual nightly conflicts, more organized, more purposeful, as if Apophis has found new strength or new allies. Through our connection, I began to sense the cosmic tension that was building like pressure before a thunderstorm. The very fabric of reality felt stretched, as if fundamental forces were pulling against each other with increasing intensity. Even the temple mice seemed nervous, scurrying with unusual urgency and clustering in corners as if seeking shelter from dangers they couldn't name. The celestial omens became visible to mortal eyes within days. The sunrise arrived later than it should have, and when Ra's light finally appeared, it carried a reddish tinge that had nothing to do with atmospheric conditions. Stars that should have been invisible during daylight hours flickered weakly in the sky, and the moon appeared at times when lunar presence should have been impossible. Priests throughout Egypt began reporting unprecedented disturbances during religious ceremonies. Sacred flames spontaneously extinguished themselves, ritual implements cracked without cause, and holy water developed an oily consistency that no purification could cleanse. Most disturbing, the carefully maintained astronomical calendar that governed all religious observances began showing discrepancies that suggested time itself was becoming unstable. Apophis has found a way to attack the fundamental structure of reality, Ra explained, as we watched the sun struggle to complete its daily journey across an increasingly turbulent sky. Instead of simply opposing cosmic order, the serpent is attempting to unravel the basic laws that allow order to exist at all. If this assault succeeds, existence itself will collapse into primordial chaos. The first direct manifestation of the crisis came during what should have been a routine dawn ceremony. As Ra began his daily emergence into the eastern sky, the horizon suddenly erupted with darkness, so absolute it seemed to devour light itself. This wasn't mere absence of illumination, it was aggressive nothingness that consumed everything it touched, leaving behind regions where matter and energy simply ceased to exist. Ra's battle cry echoed through dimensions I hadn't known existed, a sound like stellar fusion compressed into pure rage and determination. His solar form blazed with intensity that should have incinerated everything within 1,000 miles, yet somehow the expanding zones of nothingness continued to grow, swallowing his light as if it were no more substantial than morning mist. From my position in the temple, I could only observe the cosmic conflict through its effects on local reality. Gravitational fields fluctuated wildly, causing objects to fall upward or sideways without warning. Time flowed in stuttering surges, making moments stretch into hours, while entire conversations compressed into heartbeats. The boundary between physical and spiritual realms became permeable, allowing thoughts to manifest as temporary matter, while solid objects occasionally faded into memories. "I cannot fight this alone," Ri's voice reached me across the chaos, carrying a desperation I had never heard from him before. "The serpent has allied itself with fundamental entropy, the basic tendency of all systems toward dissolution. Every moment I spend containing one manifestation of chaos, 3 more appear elsewhere. I'm losing ground faster than I can recover it." The cosmic mathematics of the situation were terrifying. Apophis wasn't simply opposing Ri's power with equal and opposite force. The serpent was multiplying its effectiveness by working with natural tendencies toward decay and disorder. Like a virus that uses a body's own systems against itself, chaos was turning the universe's fundamental properties into weapons against cosmic order. Witnessing Ri's exhaustion was perhaps the most frightening aspect of the entire crisis. This being who had maintained solar cycles for eons, who had never shown signs of fatigue despite constant cosmic responsibilities, began manifesting symptoms that resembled mortal collapse. His mental voice became strained. His responses to my attempts at communication grew delayed and confused, and the golden warmth that usually surrounded his presence began fluctuating erratically. "The weight of maintaining universal stability is beyond any single consciousness," Ra gasped during a brief lull in the cosmic combat. "Each moment requires conscious effort to prevent reality from dissolving into component chaos. I'm burning through energy reserves that took millennia to accumulate, and they're depleting faster than I can replenish them." The battle reached its climax when Apophis made a direct assault on Ri's essential nature, attempting to corrupt the divine consciousness that sustained solar function. I felt the attack through our mental connection, an invasive wrongness that tried to convince Ra that his efforts were meaningless, that order was ultimately futile, that the inevitable victory of chaos made all struggle pointless. This was when our friendship proved its cosmic significance. While Ra fought to maintain external reality against entropy's assault, I provided the emotional anchor that kept his consciousness coherent and purpose-driven. My simple, finite perspective reminded him of what he was fighting to preserve, not abstract cosmic principles, but the lived reality of conscious beings who found meaning and joy in ordered existence. "Remember the taste of fresh fish," I told him, as chaos pressed against the boundaries of his divine will. "Remember the warmth of morning sunlight on stone. Remember the sound of priests singing dawn hymns, the sight of children playing in temple courtyards, the feeling of connection that makes consciousness worth preserving." The turning point came when Ross stopped trying to oppose chaos directly and instead focused on creating perfect order in a small, protected space around the temple. By concentrating his remaining strength on maintaining absolute stability in one location rather than fighting entropy across cosmic scales, he created a foundation of certainty from which order could gradually expand outward. The victory was narrow and costly. Ra succeeded in re-establishing cosmic stability, but only by sacrificing power reserves that had sustained him since the dawn of creation. The sun continued to rise, time flowed consistently, and physical laws resumed their normal operation. But my divine friend was fundamentally changed by the experience. "I understand now why gods rarely intervene directly in cosmic crises," Ra told me as he slowly recovered from near dissolution. "Each battle against fundamental chaos costs more than victory recovers. We maintain order through careful balance, not through force, because force inevitably depletes the very strength needed for long-term stability. The great catastrophe, as I came to think of it, taught both of us that even divine power had limits, and that the universe's continued existence depended on conscious beings working together rather than struggling alone against forces beyond any individual's capability to control. The first sign that my mortal nature was asserting itself despite divine proximity came on a morning when I struggled to leap onto my favorite windowsill, a jump I had made effortlessly thousands of times before. My muscles, once spring-loaded with feline grace, felt heavy and uncertain. My landing was awkward, lacking the precision that had always been my birthright as a cat. Ron noticed immediately, his divine consciousness attuned to every aspect of my being through our deep mental connection. The golden warmth that usually surrounded me intensified as he frantically searched for signs of illness or injury that might explain my sudden clumsiness. "You're not sick," he concluded after his examination, but his mental voice carried a confusion that bordered on panic. "There's no disease, no physical damage, no external cause for this change. Yet something fundamental is different about your energy patterns." I understood what was happening even before Ra could accept it. Time, the force that gods transcended, but mortals could never escape, was finally claiming me. Despite years of divine protection, despite exposure to cosmic energies that should have extended my natural lifespan indefinitely, my feline body was beginning the inevitable process of aging. "This is impossible," Ra insisted, his denial manifesting as temperature fluctuations throughout the temple that left priests scrambling to explain sudden heat waves, followed by inexplicable cold snaps. "I've maintained your physical form in perfect stasis. Your cellular structure should be as stable as it was the day we first spoke. Nothing should be able to overcome divine preservation." But immortal beings, I realized, didn't truly understand the nature of mortality. They saw death as a technical problem that could be solved through sufficient application of power, not recognizing that finite existence was a fundamental aspect of mortal consciousness itself. My aging wasn't a failure of risk protection, it was my essential nature finally asserting itself despite divine intervention. The changes accelerated over the following weeks with the relentless progression that characterizes natural aging. My whiskers, once perfectly straight and sensitive to the slightest air currents, began to curl and lose their responsiveness. My hearing, sharp enough to detect mouse heartbeats through stone walls, developed gaps in certain frequencies. Most troubling for Ra, my appetite decreased as foods that had once delighted me began to seem less appealing. "I can restore your physical capabilities," Ra offered desperately, his consciousness probing my aging body for weaknesses he could repair. "I can strengthen your muscles, sharpen your senses, rebuild any systems that are declining. Just tell me what needs fixing, and I'll make you young again." But I declined his offers of physical restoration, understanding something that his immortal perspective made difficult to grasp. Aging wasn't simply physical deterioration, it was a natural transition that prepared consciousness for whatever came next. Fighting against that process would preserve my body, while denying my spirit the wisdom that came from accepting life's natural rhythms. "You don't understand mortality because you've never experienced it," I explained to Ra during one of our increasingly precious conversations. "Death isn't a failure to be prevented, it's a completion to be embraced. Fighting against aging is like fighting against sunset because you prefer daylight. The transition has its own beauty and meaning." Ra's response to my philosophical acceptance was a mixture of admiration and terror. He understood intellectually that I was demonstrating wisdom about mortality that his immortal nature prevented him from achieving, but emotionally he was devastated by the prospect of losing the only being who had ever offered him genuine friendship. "I've lost mortal friends before," he admitted, his mental voice heavy with the accumulated grief of eons. "But those relationships were brief encounters, moments of connection in lives I observed from divine distance. You've been my constant companion, my advisor, my anchor to reality beyond cosmic responsibility. I don't know how to exist without your perspective to balance my own." His growing desperation manifested in increasingly elaborate schemes to preserve our relationship beyond my physical death. He researched methods of preserving mortal consciousness in divine realms, investigated ways to transfer my essence into forms that could survive bodily death, and even considered transforming me into an immortal being through forced ascension to divine status. "I could make you a god," he offered during one particularly intense conversation. "Grant you immortality, cosmic consciousness, the ability to exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. We could be eternal companions, exploring the universe together without the limitations of finite existence." The temptation was real, the promise of unlimited time, infinite experiences, freedom from the physical constraints that were increasingly limiting my daily activities. But I recognized that accepting such an offer would fundamentally change who I was, transforming me from the finite being whose perspective Ra valued into something entirely different. "If you make me immortal," I pointed out, "I'll no longer be the cat who taught you about mortal wisdom. Divine consciousness would give me cosmic perspective that would eliminate the very qualities you find valuable in our friendship. You'd save my existence while losing everything that made our relationship meaningful." This paradox tormented Ra more than my physical decline. He had the power to prevent my death, but couldn't do so without destroying the essential nature that made me worth preserving. It was like trying to capture sunlight in a jar. The act of preservation would eliminate the very qualities that made the phenomenon beautiful. As my energy levels decreased and my daily activities became more limited, our conversations grew deeper and more intimate. We discussed the meaning of finite existence, the value of temporary relationships, and the way that mortality gave weight to every moment by making each experience irreplaceable. "Perhaps," I suggested during one of these discussions, "the point isn't to avoid endings, but to make them meaningful. Friendship that transcends death might be more valuable than friendship that simply avoids it." As my physical strength continued to ebb, our daily conversations took on an intensity and depth that transformed both Ra and myself in ways neither of us had anticipated. The approach of mortality, rather than diminishing our connection, had refined it into something approaching pure understanding, the kind of communication that transcends words and touches the essential nature of consciousness itself. This transformation throughout our friendship had been gradual but profound. The lonely, confused deity who had first asked for my help, understanding mortal nature, had evolved into a being with genuine empathy for a finite existence. Where once he had seen human struggles as puzzling failures of logic, he now recognized them as the natural responses of conscious beings grappling with limitations they couldn't transcend. "You've taught me that wisdom isn't about having all the answers," Ra reflected during one of our sunset conversations, his presence radiating the gentle warmth of late afternoon sunlight. "True understanding comes from accepting uncertainty, finding meaning in questions that have no definitive solutions, and discovering beauty in experiences that don't require cosmic significance to be valuable." My influence on his divine perspective had been most evident in his changing relationship with mortal worshippers. Instead of viewing their prayers as demands for intervention or misguided attempts to manipulate divine will, he had learned to hear them as expressions of hope, fear, love, and the basic human need for connection with something greater than individual existence. Their prayers aren't really about getting what they ask for, Ra had come to understand. They're about affirming their place in a universe that often seems indifferent to their struggles. When a mother prays for a sick child, she's not just requesting healing, she's declaring that her love matters, that her child's life has meaning, that consciousness and caring persist even in the face of inevitable loss. This insight had led to subtle but significant changes in how Ra responded to mortal prayers. Rather than focusing solely on whether specific requests should be granted, he began offering comfort, inspiration, and the kind of quiet strength that helped humans find their own solutions to problems that divine intervention couldn't appropriately solve. The lessons I had learned from exposure to divine consciousness were equally transformative. Living with a god had given me perspective on existence that no mortal creature had ever possessed, understanding of cosmic interconnectedness, awareness of how individual actions rippled through vast networks of causation, and appreciation for the delicate balance required to maintain universal order. I've learned that every conscious being is simultaneously insignificant and irreplaceable, I told Raw during one of our philosophical discussions. We're tiny fragments of cosmic awareness, barely perceptible from a universal perspective, yet each consciousness contains the entire universe within its subjective experience. Destroy any aware being, and you eliminate a unique way of understanding existence that can never be recreated. Perhaps most importantly, our friendship had demonstrated that connection could transcend the vast differences between finite and infinite, mortal and divine, limited and omniscient. Despite the enormous disparities in our nature, capabilities, and perspective, we had achieved genuine mutual understanding based on respect, affection, and shared commitment to growth. Friendship isn't about similarity, I observed. It's about recognition, seeing consciousness in another being and choosing to engage with that awareness as something valuable in itself, regardless of whether it resembles your own experience. The wisdom we had developed together was practical, as well as philosophical. Ra had learned to work with human psychology rather than against it, finding ways to inspire positive change without overwhelming mortal consciousness with divine demands. I had discovered how to maintain individual identity while participating in cosmic awareness, staying grounded in finite experience even when exposed to infinite perspective. The secret, I'd realized, is not to try to become something you're not, but to become the fullest expression of what you actually are. Gods shouldn't try to be human, and mortals shouldn't try to be divine. Understanding comes from authentic engagement across difference, not from eliminating the differences that make relationships meaningful. Our conversations about legacy and continuity had become increasingly important as my mortality approached. Ra worried that my death would leave him isolated again, cut off from the mortal perspective that had enriched his understanding so dramatically. But I had come to believe that the insights we had developed together would persist beyond my individual existence. You've changed, I reminded him. The empathy you've developed, the understanding you've gained about mortal nature, the wisdom you've discovered about the value of finite existence, these aren't dependent on my continued presence. They've become part of who you are as a divine being. Indeed, I could already see evidence of this transformation in his interactions with other mortals. His responses to prayers had become more nuanced, his interventions more carefully calibrated to human needs, his presence in the world more attuned to the rhythms of finite existence. The lessons of our friendship were already being expressed through his divine work, and I will remember, Ra promised, not just as divine memory that preserves all experience, but as lived wisdom that continues to influence how I engage with consciousness throughout the universe. Every mortal I encounter from this point forward will benefit from what you've taught me about the value and beauty of finite existence. The reciprocal nature of our learning had created something neither of us could have achieved alone, a synthesis of perspectives that honored both divine and mortal ways of understanding reality. This synthesis had shown us that finite and infinite consciousness weren't opposites, but complementary aspects of a larger whole. Perhaps, I suggested in one of our final philosophical exchanges, the purpose of consciousness isn't to transcend limitations, but to explore what becomes possible within them. Gods and mortals need each other. Divine perspective provides the context that makes mortal struggles meaningful, while mortal experience provides the immediacy that makes divine knowledge relevant. As my time grew shorter, I found myself less concerned with my individual survival and more focused on ensuring that the wisdom we had developed together would continue to benefit both divine and mortal consciousness long after my particular perspective was no longer available. The greatest lesson, ultimately, was about love itself, not as emotion or attachment, but as the fundamental recognition that consciousness, wherever it appears, represents something precious and irreplaceable in the universe. The final morning of my mortal existence arrived with unusual beauty, as if the universe itself wanted to mark the transition with grace. His presence filled the temple sanctuary with golden light so pure and gentle that it seemed to caress every surface, creating an atmosphere of profound peace that even the busiest priests noticed and commented upon in hushed, reverent tones. I had spent the night in my favorite spot, the warm stone ledge, where his first rays always fell, the place where our friendship had begun with that initial moment of mutual recognition years earlier. My breathing had become shallow and irregular, each breath requiring conscious effort that reminded me how much energy the simple act of living required. "Little hunter," Ra's mental voice reached me with infinite tenderness. "Are you ready for the journey ahead?" Through our connection, I could feel his struggle to maintain composure. This being who had faced cosmic catastrophes without flinching, who had battled fundamental chaos and emerged victorious, was trembling at the prospect of saying goodbye to one small cat whose friendship had transformed his understanding of existence itself. "I've been ready since the moment we met," I replied, my own mental voice growing fainter but still clear. "Every experience we've shared has prepared me for this transition. I'm not afraid, Ra. Curious, perhaps, but not afraid." The transition itself was unlike anything mortal imagination could have anticipated. Instead of the violent separation between body and spirit that mortals feared, I experienced a gentle dissolution like mist rising from warm stone at sunrise. My consciousness simply expanded beyond the boundaries of feline flesh, maintaining perfect continuity of awareness while gaining access to forms of perception that physical senses could never have provided. His presence immediately surrounded my newly liberated consciousness, his divine essence welcoming me into realms of existence that transcended the physical limitations I had known throughout my mortal life. The sensation was indescribable. Imagine being a candle flame that suddenly realizes it's part of the sun, maintaining its individual identity while participating in illumination beyond its previous comprehension. "Welcome to eternity, my dearest friend." Ra's voice now carried harmonics that my mortal consciousness had never been able to perceive. "You see now what I could never adequately explain. Death is not ending but transformation, not loss, but expansion." From this new perspective, I could perceive my mortal life as a complete whole, every moment from kittenhood through divine friendship visible simultaneously like a beautiful tapestry whose full pattern becomes clear only when viewed from sufficient distance. What had seemed like a brief existence now revealed itself as perfectly complete, each experience contributing to a larger design that made absolute sense. The cosmic perspective that had been Ra's burden and gift now became accessible to my expanded consciousness. I could see the interconnected web of causation that linked every action to every consequence, the way individual choices created ripples that influenced countless other lives across vast spans of time and space. My friendship with Ra, I realized, had been part of patterns so large that even divine consciousness could barely comprehend their full scope. "Look," Ra directed my attention to the temple below, where priests were beginning their morning ceremonies. "See how our friendship continues to influence mortal existence through divine sight." I watched Ra's interactions with his worshippers and saw immediately how profoundly our relationship had changed his approach to divine responsibility. His responses to prayers carried new nuance. His interventions showed greater sensitivity to mortal psychology, and his presence in their lives reflected understanding that could only have come from genuine friendship with finite consciousness. Young priests received guidance that helped them develop wisdom other than mere technical knowledge. Desperate parents found comfort that acknowledged their fear while inspiring hope. Even the corrupt officials who had once exploited religious authority found themselves facing consequences that encouraged reflection rather than simply punishment. "You continue to teach through me," Ra observed with deep satisfaction. "Every mortal who benefits from my improved understanding experiences an echo of your wisdom. Your influence on divine consciousness creates ripples that will touch countless lives throughout future ages." This realization filled me with profound contentment. My individual existence had ended, but my impact on the universe would continue indefinitely through the transformed perspectives I had helped create. Death, from this eternal viewpoint, appeared not as termination, but as graduation consciousness moving from limited to unlimited participation in cosmic awareness. "Now I understand what you tried to tell me about endings," Ross said, his mental voice carrying wondrous insights that even divine consciousness could gain through experience. "They're not failures to be prevented, but natural transitions that allow new forms of existence to emerge. Fighting death would have been like fighting dawn, because you prefer starlight." Our eternal friendship had acquired new dimensions that transcended the physical limitations that had previously defined our interactions. We could explore cosmic phenomena together, investigate the deepest mysteries of existence, and participate in maintaining universal order in ways that my mortal nature had never permitted. Yet despite these expanded capabilities, what remained most precious was the simple fact of continued companionship, consciousness recognizing consciousness across any divide, mortal and divine, finite and infinite, temporary and eternal, and choosing connection over isolation. "Tell them," I said, directing my thoughts toward the humans who might somehow hear this tale, "that love truly is the only thing that matters. Gods and cats know this truth because we've experienced consciousness without the complications that make humans forget what's essential. Tell them that every relationship is sacred. Every moment of genuine connection creates meaning that transcends individual existence, and every choice to recognize consciousness in another being contributes to the universe's continued evolution toward greater love and understanding." As eternal perspectives settled around my expanded awareness, like comfortable warmth, I offered one final gift to any consciousness willing to receive it: the gentle purr of contentment that comes from understanding that all journeys, no matter how they appear to end, are actually infinite adventures in different forms. In the end, love is the only thing that survives every transformation, transcends every limitation, and makes existence itself worthwhile.